We are now well into the off-season with the end-of-season awards being given out very soon. However, we are no closer to concrete answers for Player of the Year in MPO. Let's look at the different arguments for each name in contention and see if we can make some sense of this. But first, hello, I'm Mason and welcome to The Wind Read. The consensus is that there's a 3-horse race at this point for Calvin Heimberg, Ganon Burr, and Isaac Robinson to be your 2023 Player of the Year. Now, there are other disc golfers that can be included in this conversation. Ricky Wysocki, despite missing significant time, won an Elite Series event and the Tour Championship, one of the most coveted titles of the season. He also ranked second in average event finish. Another name thrown around was Kyle Klein, who also had 2 wins on the season, of course, including a major title. Simon Lizotte is also worth mentioning with 2 important wins on the season. However, these 3, in my opinion, are just slightly outpaced by Calvin, Isaac, and Ganon, and it is very close. Before we jump to conclusions or let our fandom bias sway us in one direction, let's first look at some concrete numbers. From a pure wins perspective at Elite Series and Majors, Ganon leads the division with 3, while Isaac and Calvin both have 2. Before I go into more, let's just pause for a second and think about how much this division has truly changed. Ganon is in the Player of the Year running with 3 wins. Go back just a few years to the late 2010s, the Ricky and Macbeth era, and look at the win totals on these seasons. Paul and Rick were regularly putting up 7, 8, or 9 wins in a single season. Things have changed so much. Going back to our 3-horse race, the quality of wins is of course worth discussing. While Ganon has 3 wins at Elite Series and Calvin has 2, Isaac Robinson's wins both came in the form of major titles, which should not be taken lightly. Wins are massive, but of course aren't everything. When we look at statistics regarding consistency, the arrow points to Calvin. He has 18 top 10s in 19 starts and an average event finish of just over 4, beating out these other 2 guys substantially. In particular, his podium rate this year was exceptional. Calvin finished on the podium 11 times, equaling a nearly 58% podium rate, another statistic that makes Isaac's and Ganon's pale in comparison. So really, when it comes down to the Player of the Year debate, what side of the aisle you decide on kind of depends on how heavily you emphasize consistency versus quality of wins versus sheer number of wins. There's arguments to be made for Ganon or Isaac or Calvin, and I don't think there's any blatantly wrong answers here. I think it's interesting that the season ended this way. It opened the door for these types of engaging discussions and only further drives home the point that MPO has entered a new era of competitiveness. In a season that saw 13 unique winners on the Pro Tour, the fact that the Player of the Year debate is this hotly contested is not surprising, and may even hint at what will become more commonplace year after year in the future. So let's get back to the debate. Like I mentioned, how someone votes for Player of the Year depends a lot on what they emphasize as important. If it's the number of wins, then Ganon Burr might be their favorite. And I can see this argument. There was so much parity and razor-close finishes at events this year. Who can actually get over the finish line is incredibly important. We've seen players time and time again playing their best disc golf on moving day, but when the final round comes, they cannot close the deal. Ganon proved that he can. Though his season contained a lot of ups and downs, Burr did what most could not. He closed out tournaments. And if you add his 2 silver wins into the mix as well, his case becomes even stronger. But is it strong enough? Most don't quite think so. Public opinion, at least from what I've seen, hints at the fact that Ganon falls into this gray area of the argument being made, that being the quality of wins in Isaac Robinson versus the consistency of Calvin Heimberg. Ganon has the most wins, but these wins were not majors, and at the same time, he didn't have the consistency either. If Ganon could have had just one more win at an Elite Series, I think this balance might have just tipped in his favor. Still, Ganon is in the running, and it'll be interesting to see where the votes shake up. So let's narrow it down further. We have Calvin with his unreal consistency, or Isaac with his double major season. It's ironic that this player of the year conversation is juxtaposing Calvin's insane consistency versus Isaac's major dominance when Isaac was not that consistent and Calvin underperformed at the majors. Like I said, what should we view as more important? From my perspective, it's very close, and I think that anyone framing it as a landslide for one or the other is not taking in the full picture, at least in my opinion. You cannot deny the greatness of Isaac Robinson winning 2 major titles in one extraordinary season. 2 majors in one season was great 5 years ago, but in this new era of our game, it is absurd. Whether you're a fan of it or not, the majors are the big ones. These tournaments and their results stand the test of time. Some would argue that in a decade from now, Isaac's season will be more memorable because of these major titles, specifically his world championship, more than Calvin's consistency. I'm not sure. That being said, Calvin was not just consistent, he was absurdly consistent. What also stands out was just how much more consistent he was than everyone else. In a season that ushered in a new level of parity in MPO, Calvin Heimberg stayed in the conversation every single tournament. He'd either get off to a fantastic start and stay on lead card round after round, or he'd start slow and then right on cue come surging up the leaderboard on moving day. Most specifically, his podium percentage being substantially higher than anyone else in the division is hard to argue against. Maybe it's also not quite fair to everyone else, but Calvin's ridiculous highlight reel from 2023 season surely played into the minds of the voters. His insane aces and double throw-ins in one round, that has to play a role. Really, no matter what happens or who receives the Player of the Year award, the fact that we're having this conversation says a lot about the state of the division. A few years ago, Ricky and Paul would scoff at a 2 or 3 win season, but in 2023, it's enough to position someone firmly in the Player of the Year race. Wins are far more difficult to come by and hold much greater weight, as does consistency. It's hard to stay in the conversation week after week with the talent that has flooded the division. It is an exciting time to be a fan of disc golf. Make sure to tune in to the Disc Golf Pro Tour's End of Year Awards show presented by OTB Discs. This will be hosted on the Jomez Pro channel later this week. Thank you so much for joining me here on The Wind Read. Until the next one.